Hey guys, Quiff the Lazy Geek here and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about those two telescopes here and compare them because a lot of you guys in the comments have asked me to compare the Skywatcher Quattro 150p Newtonian telescope with the Celestron C6 schmidt-cassegrain telescope with Hyperstar. And so let's do just that. I'm going to start by just introducing the two telescopes if you're not familiar. On my right, on your left, we have the Celestron C6. This is a schmidt-cassegrain telescope. It has an aperture of 150 millimeters and a focal length of around 1,500 millimeters for a very slow native focal ratio of f10. But what I did to this telescope is I added a lens at the front of the telescope that replaces the secondary mirror there, and then a camera that's on top of that lens. With this setup, the lens is called Hyperstar. It's a product available from a company called Starizona. I'll put all of the links to everything in the description down below. But it basically transforms this telescope from f10 to f2, which is extremely fast. And at f2, we have a focal length of 300 millimeters. And on my left, or your right, I have the Skywatcher Quattro 150p Newtonian telescope. It has also an aperture of 150 millimeters, and it has a native focal ratio of f4. The scope, however, comes with a focal reducer / coma corrector that changes the focal ratio from f4 to around f4.45. I've also done some modifications to the telescope that bring it to more something like f3.6, something like that. So at first glance, they're very similar because they're both the same aperture telescope. And 150 millimeter aperture for a reflecting telescope is like kind of a sweet spot that I really like. It's not too small, not too big, and you can do a lot of things. This telescope on the left has 517 millimeters of focal length with the focal reducer installed, and this one has 300. So obviously, this telescope on the left will be able to go deeper into images and into nebulae that I want to image, galaxies, etc. This one is going to be more of a wide field machine. But we'll look a bit later about the versatility of both telescopes. Let's start with the price of both. The price of this one, I think the telescope on its own is around $850 US. And on top of that, once you add the Hyperstar lens, that's an additional $500, if I remember correctly. So you're at already $1,350 US. I also highly recommend a dew shield like this one from Celestron that cannot really shift much, because when you want to take flat frames to correct for optical issues of the system or dust motes as well, if the dew shield has switched position a little bit, it can actually mess up your flat frames. And so using a manual, like a home-built dew shield, or using something that cannot really be fixed in place well, might be an issue. And that's why I bought this one. I think it was around $80. So that puts us above $1,400 US for this. This is not cheap. In contrast, on the left-hand side, the telescope, so the main optical tube assembly with the mirrors inside and the focal reducer / coma corrector, came on sale for $450 US, at least for me here in Japan. I'd say normally it retails more at around $600 US. So this is what we're going to take for the telescope, $600 US. In theory, that should be the end of it. Unfortunately, the Newtonian needs a lot of babysitting and a lot of modifications before it becomes truly usable. I've detailed those modifications in previous videos, so I'll put some links above and also some links in the description if you're interested. But what I've done, and what I think is absolutely critical, is adding a dew shield. This one is 3D printed, homemade. You can use cardboard that you paint black with something like Musso black paint, for instance. Again, links in the description. And I've also flocked the inside of the telescope tube to reduce reflections and stray rays of light. And that makes a big difference, and I think it is critical. But that's just like something like with, let's say, $20-30 US, we're good. So let's say that puts our total as $630 US. I also MacGyvered some kind of butt plug for my telescope to also reduce the amount of light that can make it through the primary mirror at the back here. And I've also changed the secondary mirror holder, as well as added a mirror mask to remove the shadows of the clips effectively from the image. The mirror is held in place by 3 mirror clips. Those mirror clips are visible in the field of view, and therefore they cause some weird diffraction artifacts on the stars. With a mask, we can remove that. I think though the secondary mirror holder, the default one can be used as is, but I would really recommend having the primary mirror mask. Again, I'll put links in the description. With that, it brings the total, I think it was 50 euros, so let's say 60 US dollars. Let's say we are at around 700 US dollars for the minimum modifications that you want to do with this telescope. But that's not the end of the list. I've noticed another issue with the telescope with long exposures recently, and we'll look at it later on together, is it's very likely that my focuser has some sag, which means that when you're doing long exposures, as the telescope is kind of moving across the sky to follow the stars, the telescope draw tube from the focuser will sag a little bit, which will basically make the stars trail. And a dead giveaway for that is if you have stars trailing most of the time, except when you're close to zenith, when you're looking almost above. If you have less star trailing, it means likely the cause is focuser sag. And this is what I have. With this telescope, you do not know which focuser you're going to be getting. There is a decent focuser and there is a terrible focuser. And I have not been able to figure out who gets what, or whether it's country related, whether it's shop related, what it is related to. Some people have gotten a good focuser or decent focuser. I have a bad one. To make the distinction is if you have like kind of a flat part on your focuser draw tube, it means you have the bad one. If you have some kind of metallic rail instead of that flat part, you have the decent one. Well done. If you have the decent one, there's probably nothing more to do and you're good with 700 US dollars. If you have the bad one like I do and you want to take long exposures for narrowband imaging, for instance, then you'll likely want to replace the focuser, and that's something that I'm looking into. I found what appears to be a decent replacement for 300 US dollars, but I'm still looking into it. But that would bring the total price to 1,000 US dollars. Still considerably cheaper than the Hyperstar. But there is still one more thing to consider. You want to get tools to collimate this telescope. This telescope can be collimated fairly easily, to some extent, on just pointing at stars. This one requires very precise placement of both the secondary mirror and the primary mirror. The secondary mirror in particular is a nightmare to collimate, and I highly recommend an electronic collimator called the OCAL. The OCAL is something that I didn't want to use with this telescope because I wanted to stay as cheap as possible, but in the end, without it, I was not able to get like really good collimation without spending literally hours on adjusting things with a Cheshire eyepiece and then a sighting tube and that kind of stuff. So if you have an OCAL collimator, the collimation can be done in like 5 to 20 minutes depending on how far off you're in the beginning, but that's at an additional cost of I think around 200 US dollars, bringing the total cost if you have the bad focuser to 1,200 US dollars. Still cheaper than the Hyperstar solution, but it's getting closer. If you did get the good focuser with the Quattro 150p, then you're still around 900 US dollars, so you're still much better off than the Hyperstar solution. So you can see the price is not that easy to tell you because there's the price for the tube itself. Here it's far cheaper. And there's also the price for the modifications that need to be done. The C6 Hyperstar basically requires no modifications. This one does. Which brings me to my next point, which is the ease of setup until you can actually use the telescope properly. With the C6 Hyperstar, it was, for me, very easy to actually start getting images that were decent. Not perfect, the stars in the corners have issue, but the images are decent. It was really a matter of connecting, like screwing on the Hyperstar lens onto the telescope, putting the camera on, and with the adapters that are provided by Starizona when you buy the Hyperstar lens, there's no more fiddling around to do. You can and should probably check the collimation of the Hyperstar lens, but that's actually fairly easy to change, and you can also buy or build a cheap Bahtinov or tried Bahtinov mask to check that collimation. Still, it gives good results. To me, it gave good results out of the box. I also needed the lens hood here to really dial in my setup, because without a good lens hood like the one that I have here, I had often issues with my flats that made this telescope sometimes frustrating to use. In the past, I didn't really have those issues. Then a few months ago, I started having those issues, and then they were completely resolved with this. But if you bought like the telescope, the Hyperstar lens, and the lens hood, you should be good to go. It should be a very easy setup. On this side, as I alluded to in the price, there's a lot of things to do. You need to get yourself a dew shield, just like this one, but I don't think there's any dew shield or a lens hood that is available directly from Skywatcher, so you need to find it somewhere or build it on your own. The advantage is that the flat frames are going to be much less sensitive to the angle of the dew shield and whether it has shifted a little bit compared to the Celestron. So you can probably make one out of cardboard and black paint and you should be good. You also need to open up the telescope, ideally even removing the primary mirror cell to flock the inside of the telescope. That's quite a bit of work. You also want to add a mirror mask, if possible, on the primary mirror. That's also some work. You want to add and build and add this kind of butt plug here and make sure that it cannot let any light through. A lot of people use a shower cap. I've noticed that shower caps are just not opaque enough for my needs, especially when I'm in Tokyo where there's a lot of stray light. And you'll also want to try to really add some tape all over the place to kind of make sure you don't have any light leaks, because with this telescope, if you use it as it is, at first, you'll get tons of reflections within your images that cannot be solved with flat frames and cannot be solved with background extraction. It's gonna be frustrating until you do all of the flocking inside of the telescope, until you add the butt plug, until you add the tape all around to remove light leaks. And also until you do proper collimation, because when I received the telescope, the secondary mirror for me was terribly placed. It was too far away from the primary mirror, and it only reflected part of the image to the camera. It was a big mess. So you'll need to spend time collimating the telescope. That said, if you end up buying the Spider from Backyard Universe, again, all links on the description, which would put the total price at around $1,350 if you have the bad focuser, then you will probably not need to recollimate for a long while. It's been holding collimation extremely well for a long while. I haven't had to redo the collimation since I did it originally with the Ocal collimator. But you can see it's a lot of work to get it working at a decent level to really make it usable for good astrophotography. But let's talk a little bit about versatility of those telescopes, because this telescope on my left, the Newtonian, basically it's a single focal length telescope. We have f4 or f3.6, roughly between 517 millimeters and 600 millimeters of focal length. It's good because I think it's a kind of a sweet spot that's in between wide field and really pushing into the objects. I kind of like the field of view that it gives me. In contrast, when you have the C6 here, if you pair it with Hyperstar, you have 300 millimeters of focal length, but you also have other adapters from Starizona that can be put at the back of the telescope along with the camera. So you switch between a lens at the front and a secondary mirror, and then putting a focal reducer at the back. And the focal reducer, you have several choices. You have a 0.75 times focal reducer, you have 0.63 times focal reducer, and you also have an upcoming 0.4 times focal reducer that would make the telescope f4 here, basically just like this one with a focal length of 600 millimeters or so. You can see that you have a lot of versatility on this telescope, the C6 Hyperstar, compared to the Newtonian. The Newtonian is a one-trick pony. The C6 Hyperstar is a jack of all trade, but maybe master of none? We'll see once we actually test the images between those two telescopes, because of course I took images to check. Talking about versatility, one of the things, and ease of use, like going more towards ease of use once you've completed the setup for both telescopes, the ease of use is very similar. But if you're using Hyperstar, one of the big things is that you have your camera at the front of the telescope, right? You cannot use a filter wheel. You cannot automate filter changing. You have to manually go in and switch the filter. And if you're having a monochrome camera and you need to do that several times per night, it's difficult to be lazy, right? So, and I like being lazy. So that's a drawback to the Hyperstar lens. Now, if you are using, instead of the Hyperstar lens, let's say the 0.4, the upcoming 0.4 times reducer that goes at the back of the telescope, then you would no longer have anything in front of the lens here, and you could use a filter wheel. So with the versatility can come changes in the ease of use of the telescope. This one here can accept a filter wheel, but I'll make the assumption that you've changed the focuser if you had the bad one, because I'm pretty sure that this focuser with a filter wheel would be catastrophic because of the added weight. Now let me talk a bit more about the focal ratios of those two telescopes. Both telescopes have the same 150 millimeters aperture, so they both collect the same amount of photons in a given amount of time. So every second we'll have like the same number of photons going into this telescope as that one. However, they spread out the light differently, right? That's where the focal ratio comes in. This one will basically provide more photons for each pixel of your camera compared to that one in a given unit of time. In exchange, this one, the C6 Hyperstar, sacrifices some resolution compared to the Newtonian here that will have more resolution, but less light or fewer photons per pixel per unit of time. So that's like the basics. So this one goes a bit deeper, has a bit more resolution, a bit less field of view, and a bit less light per pixel. That one, with the same camera, that one, the C6, has a wider field of view, but less resolution and more photons per pixel. In the end, how you choose to use this is kind of up to you. Obviously, with the C6 Hyperstar, you have the versatility of using a focal reducer as well as at the back of the telescope to change how deep you want to go into your star fields, nebulae, or galaxies. There is one thing though to note with Hyperstar is that if you like to do narrowband imaging, which is something of a mandatory kind of thing to do when you're in a light polluted city like here in Tokyo, is that narrowband filters don't like fast systems. I've talked about it quite a lot, but basically the incidence angle of light rays when you have very fast focal ratios like the C6 Hyperstar here will cause a bandpass shift of narrowband filters. And so you need to buy pre-shifted narrowband filters, hope that they're up to specs, and hope that they're going to work well for your system if you want to do narrowband with Hyperstar. And that is something that I was okay with at first, but I'm getting more and more tired of. Right now, I'm having my best filter in there for narrowband. It is the Antlia ALPT high-speed filter that has H-alpha and oxygen-3 narrowband for emission nebula. It works great, but I'm limited to a 5 nanometer bandpass compared to 4 nanometer here that I have in there. And that particular filter has star halos and reflections as well. So when wanting to do narrowband, having a very fast focal ratio really reduces the choice that you have in your filters. And so you have to make some kind of sacrifice. And if you choose to go with a filter like the IDAS NBZ, which is a great filter and doesn't have any reflections or that kind of stuff, it will work great on this telescope. But then you have 12 nanometer band passes. So it will pass in more light pollution, decreasing the signal to noise ratio. So on the one hand, the very fast focal ratio will help the signal to noise ratio per pixel, but it will damage it because you're using wider bandpasses on your narrowband filter. So there are really limitations to using Hyperstar for narrowband. For broadband though, it's really amazing. It's really awesome. And I've taken some amazing pictures of, for example, the Pleiades in broadband from Tokyo using Hyperstar. I loved doing that. It was a lot of fun. This telescope, in contrast, still has a fairly fast focal ratio of f3.6, so it's probably not the best for 3 nanometer, for like the very tightest narrowband filters of 3 nanometer or so. But if you're going to use something like 4 nanometers, like what I have in there with my Altair dual band narrowband filter, then things become really nice. And 4 nanometer bandpass filters are wider should work well on this telescope. So you're much less restricted to your choice of narrowband filters due to the slower focal ratio compared to Hyperstar. Obviously, again, you can solve that for Hyperstar by using a focal reducer instead of Hyperstar. So you just remove the Hyperstar lens and you reuse the Celestron C6 telescope. One of the differences as well that we have between the two telescopes is the automated focus adjustment that I put there. I have the focus mechanism on the C6. You're moving the primary mirror to do the focusing. On this one, you're moving the focuser draw tube. So you have the draw tube that basically extends out of the telescope, which can lead to sag, as I was mentioning earlier. With this one, there's not going to be any focuser sag. You're going to have some mirror shift to some extent, but that's not such a huge deal, especially with such a small mirror in this telescope. And if you want to change from Hyperstar at the front to a focal reducer at the back, you don't need to change the electronic focuser there. It can stay in place and it will just work as well. So that's really good to know. Okay, so I've harped on and on and on about the differences between those telescopes. Which one do I personally prefer? I'm not going to tell you yet, because we have to check the results of those telescopes. I took on the same nights images of the Crescent Nebula with both telescopes with the same total integration time. We'll be able to look at the results together. Before we do that, I want to give a big shout out to my Patreon supporters and channel members. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. Some of my Patreon member ranks have access to my videos in advance and without ads. If that sounds interesting to you, the link is down in the description. It also truly makes the channel possible. So thank you so much. Also, while you're at it, you may want to subscribe to the channel if you're new, in which case, welcome. You can like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you hated it, and leave a comment. Leaving comments is amazing. It's always fun to see discussions beneath the video, and I also read all the comments and reply as much as I can. Anyway, let's get inside to compare the results on the Crescent Nebula for those two telescopes. And here we have the result of the comparison between Hyperstar and the Newtonian. Let's have a look. On the left-hand side, we have the C6 Hyperstar telescope result, and on the right-hand side, we have the Quattro 150p result with on the Crescent Nebula. Both of them have the same amount of exposure time taken during the same nights, at the same times, on the same target, so everything like controlled like that. The cameras used are also nearly identical. It is the same sensor, the IMX571, so really trying to be as close as possible. That said, this is narrowband imaging for now. I might do a follow-up while I try broadband, but for now we're using narrowband. And the Hyperstar image on the left used an ALPT high-speed filter from Amplia, made for high-speed systems, and the one on the right used the Altair 4 nanometer dual band filter, which means that in terms of band pass and light pollution rejection, the Newtonian had a slight advantage. And this is kind of intentional in a way, simply because there are not many filters for narrowband available specifically for high-speed systems like the C6 Hyperstar. So I'm testing it within the confines of what is available to it. Okay, so let's have a quick look at how those pictures look like. So both are 10 hours of data across 2 nights. Also the mounts was the SEM60 for the Hyperstar and the AM5 from ZW for the NEWT, and I noticed that the RMS was very similar between both of them, so I don't expect the RMS to have played any part in the results. I've already done processing on both images, and I've also done drizzling on both images, so 2 times factor drizzle on both. So we obviously see from at first glance that the Hyperstar image has a wider field of view. Makes sense, simply because the focal length is lower even though we have the same sensor size, so wider field of view. And I like that wider field of view because we have access to this huge amount of red nebulosity on the right hand side and on the right hand side and left hand side, sorry, whereas this is not available for the Newtonian. That said, we also have, like, the Crescent Nebula is much smaller at the center compared to the Newtonian. This is only due to the focal length that we're talking about. If we are zooming into the hyperstar system, we can see the stars at the center are decent, but just like as usual with my hyperstar, I noticed they are a bit more bloated than normal. If I look at the center stars on the Newtonian, they're less bloated, roughly for the same amount of zoom, right? The Crescent Nebula is roughly the same for both, but the stars are less bloated for the Newtonian system. And this is not only due to the bandpass of the narrowband filters. I've noticed the same thing for hyperstar in broadband, and something I've noted in some previous videos as well. My hyperstar might not be perfectly collimated, and sometimes because I'm not a pixel peeper, I don't strive to achieve perfection. Where this becomes obvious is if I zoom into the stars in the corner, they're misshapen, right? They're starting to get like kind of almost have spikes, Newtonian spikes on them, like triangular stars. But for me, for my needs, this has always been like perfectly fine, right? Whereas if I look at the stars on the Newtonian, even if I go into the corners, the stars are very well controlled. They're a bit like starting to get misshapen, but for such a cheap Newtonian telescope, at least on its own, it's doing pretty well. And by the way, one of the things you noticed is that the image on the left for hyperstar is mirrored compared to the image on the right for the Newtonian. And this is simply because hyperstar, we use a single mirror to focus onto the hyperstar lens and then the camera, whereas the Newtonian has two mirrors, right? So the Newtonian has the correct orientation, whether the hyperstar has a mirrored image, which is very easy to get rid of. So let's do some dynamic background extraction, right? So here we have like the hyperstar with dynamic background extraction, and I've done dynamic background extraction to the Newtonian as well. So we can see the results are pretty good. This is something that I noticed for both. The field was quite flat. The dynamic background extraction almost did nothing for the Newtonian, and it did a bit more for the hyperstar. In particular, the hyperstar center tends to be brighter regardless of how well I do my flats correction. But that's kind of like a fact of life. That said, my Newtonian is definitely a bit easier to deal with in terms of gradients, flat frames, all that kind of stuff. This also has to do with the speed of the system. An F2 system like hyperstar on the left is always more difficult to deal with. And now this is the result after the spectrophotometric color calibration is applied. We're still on the drizzled image, and I'd like to go and look at the details of the Crescent Nebula. And if we look into the details, you can see that I have stars trailing on the Newtonian. And I believe it's very likely, as I was mentioning earlier, that it is due to the focuser draw tube sagging during the long exposures. I do not see this with like 30 seconds or 60 seconds or even 2-minute exposures, despite like perfect guiding, really. But despite the fact that the stars are elongated in the Newtonian and they are not in the hyperstar, I have so much more detail in the nebula compared to like when I compare both. Like the image on the hyperstar looks blurry compared to the image from the Newtonian. Okay, but let's see what happens after I apply some blur exterminator, so deconvolution on both images, and also I mirror the image on the hyperstar. So again, the left hand side we have the hyperstar, the right hand side we have the Newtonian, and I can see so much more detail in the Newtonian image than the hyperstar image, and I do not think it's linked only to the focal length again. That said, with both of them, I'm very happy to see that the envelope, the oxygen-3 envelope of the nebula is definitely visible and quite clear, but I am very surprised to actually see it appears to be clearer and to have a better signal to noise ratio in the image on the right hand side. And I'm wondering if it has to do with the fact that very often the center of the image for hyperstar is brighter and maybe that is lowering contrast. But I definitely seem to be able to see the lobes there of the nebula better in the Newtonian image than the hyperstar. This is quite unexpected. I expected them to be more or less equal because the hyperstar image has 5 nanometer bandpasses in the narrowband filter compared to the Newtonian image that has 4 nanometer. So I expected like the bandwidth of the filters to kind of counteract the speed difference between the telescopes, but it seems the Newtonian has done considerably better at the cost of course, a smaller field of view. Fun thing though, for both images, if I go down from the nebula, you might be able to see it here. We have the soap bubble nebula. It is visible and I've managed to image it from Tokyo. I think it's the first time I achieved that, so I'm super hyped about this. This is just 2 nights of data and the soap bubble is visible. This is so cool. This is really amazing. And it's visible on both images, but again, it seems to be clearer on the Newtonian. I have now processed both images to taste. For the Crescent Nebula, again, on the left-hand side, we have Hyperstar. On the right-hand side, we have the Newtonian. And the Hyperstar image has its own charm with the wider field of view, the details of the nebulosity. We can see the arc of nebulosity going all the way there. This is one of the big advantages of Hyperstar. You have a fast system with a very nice field of view that is available, which makes it more appropriate for smaller sensors as well, like the 533 sensors. And if we zoom into the nebula has a lot of details as well on both images, but again, more details in the Newtonian. But I really personally like both images quite a lot. I am surprised by some of the results, especially the sharpness in the Crescent Nebula. It means that the Newtonian setup, if you're going to be doing planetary nebulae and galaxy imaging, it is much better than my Hyperstar setup, and not just because of the focal length. That said, the Hyperstar setup, you might be able to change Hyperstar to have just a focal reducer at the back of the telescope, a longer focal length, and maybe not have like the fatter stars that lead to less details. So if you get the C6 Hyperstar, you always have that option, whereas for the Newtonian, you're limited to basically a single focal length, or a single focal length range. So what are your thoughts on this? I think a lot of people were expecting me to say like, you should be buying the C6 Hyperstar or you should be buying the Newtonian. But that's not how it works. It really all depends on what you want to achieve and what your needs are. And that's why I went into so many of the details about like what I see in terms of advantages and drawbacks for each of the system as much as I can, and also looking at the image quality and at the final images. But again, let me know what you think in the comments. Like the video or dislike it. If you didn't like it, subscribe to the channel if you're new, in which case, welcome. You can even subscribe to my Patreon or join the channel as a member if you want to support me financially. But more important than all of that, don't forget whenever you can to look up at the stars, and I'll see you next time.